Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to welcome you all to the EVPA webinar on system change and investing for impact, why we need it, what it is, and how to get started. My name is Anja König. I'm the DACH representative of the European Venture Philanthropy Association, and I will be hosting today's meeting. Before we dive into the topic of today's webinar, I'd like to walk you through some of the technical aspects. You are able to open and hide the control panel, which is the console that appears on the right-hand side of your, that's me. And that's the control panel that you should see on the right-hand side of your screen. It collapses automatically when it's not being used, but you can make it visible via the view menu on the top. So we're expecting quite a number of participants today in the session. So we'll keep participants muted first in the first part of the presentation in order to avoid noise interferences. But we encourage you to raise questions or comments that you might have on the presentations, and please write them into the question sections on the control panel. We'll have an opportunity to discuss them at the during the last part of our session today. If for some reasons we have not been able to answer some of those questions or comments or react to them, please feel free to contact us afterwards, and we will ensure that we will follow up. Last but not least, the session is recorded, and we will make, together with the presentation, we will also make this available to our EVPA members. So just quickly on system change at EVPA, why is this really important to us? EVPA is a membership organization currently gathering more than 300 members from all across Europe that are interested in or practicing venture philanthropy and social investing or investing for impact. Our members include foundations, social investors, academics, financial institutions, and service providers, as well as government institutions and development agencies. So there are two reasons really why we're looking at system change at EVPA. First, in the face of the societal challenges that we're all facing and our members are facing, the broader EVPA community is increasingly looking at ways how to deepen and scale their impact. But at the same time, we also sense that there was uncertainty around what actually system change means, and specifically what the role for investors for impact could be in the system, the broader system change agenda, and maybe most importantly, how to even get started on such a complex topic. Secondly, EVPA is not only a membership network, but we also consider ourselves as ecosystem builders. So many of our services and activities are provided to the broader community of individuals and organizations that use finance for impact. And we really see ourselves as catalysts of bringing different actors together in order to increase mutual understanding, shared value, and an impact. And we see our role in connecting those dots and facilitate these kind of interactions and conversations. So in a sense, systems thinking is crucial really to our role as an ecosystem builder, and we try and really strive to become more effective in this ecosystem building role every day at what we do. So it's my pleasure really to introduce today our two panelists, our speakers, real system change leaders that are here with us today and will guide us through the topic and share the experience. So Anna Birni leads the Forum for the Future School of System Change. She coaches on a wide number of projects and initiatives across sectors and systems. She's also our author of a book on cultivating system change based on her PhD. So she spent really a long time working on this topic, both in theory as well as in practice. And Anna will take us through the first part of this webinar. Forum for the Future itself is a leading international nonprofit working with business, government, and civil society. And systems practices are really at the foundation of all the work they do. And I'm sure she will mention a bit more later on. And then we have Saskia van der Doel of the Adesium Foundation. She's Director of Programs at the Adesium Foundation and really one of the oldest members, EVPA members, and really philanthropic leader with programs ranging from marine conservation to interventions promoting open and democratic societies and social initiatives. And she will share with us later on what her experience is and why this topic is of interest to her. So in terms of our agenda for today, it's really, so the objectives are really to introduce you to what system change means and why this is critical for funding and investing in sustainability challenges. We will hear about some system change tools and examples. And we hope that it will help you to start thinking about the role of finance and your own role as investor, and maybe possibly personally also in driving system change. So we will start with a contribution from Anna for the next 30 minutes or so, who will introduce you into the why, what, and how of system change, and also provide a few examples. We then have the contribution from Saskia to share her experience about why this is important. System thinking is important to them, and we will then have an opportunity for questions and a bit more in-depth discussion. So let me hand over to Anna so that she can share her experience. Anna, that's perfect. It's just that we can't hear you. Oh, I have to. Okay, can you say something now?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, now it works. Perfect.
Great. Now I just need to, here we go. So it's lovely to have, I think, over about 33 of you on this call. And it's great to start to introduce kind of some of our experience and some of the collation of systems change approaches that we've been looking at the School of Systems Change. And yeah, this webinar, as Anya's already said, will be kind of a brief run through. You know, we often get asked, could you do a quick session on systems change? And actually this topic in itself has many facets and many orientations. So hopefully this is kind of just a very small taster to what you can expect when you're starting to do systems change. So let me see if I can scroll down. Yes. So actually, the first question I like to ask at the beginning of workshops or seminars is, what are our assumptions about how the world works? And that is a massive question. And I guess it speaks to the fact that system change is a massive topic. And it really is trying to get to the underpinning values and ideas about the way the world operates. So I just encourage you, and I know we can't really see each other, and it's quite hard to be interactive on such a large webinar, but I'd really encourage you to just reflect for sort of 20 seconds. You know, how do you think the world works? If you were to think about one or two words or an image even, because a lot of systems work is about thinking not just in linear language, but start thinking in maps and diagrams and more frameworks. What little vision would you draw about how the world works? And so a lot of people who do this exercise in our workshops often come up with quite a messy diagram on their piece of paper. They come up with network maps with perhaps literally a picture of the whole world. They come up with kind of people, or they come up with resources, and they usually come up with lots of lines, lots of connective diagrams, or very kind of messy, circular, different diagrams. So why is this important? Well, we can say that there's actually for me, there are 4 kind of principles that we might be able to apply to how the world works. The first principle is this idea of multi-level fractals. And this diagram on the left-hand side really looks at the kind of the image of a brain cell and the image of the universe. And what you can see is these 2 images look very similar. So the idea is there's a repeating pattern in the universe that happens at multiple levels, that happens at this minute cellular level all the way through to the universe. And we can put something in the middle there about a network pattern of the way humans sort of connect, or the way the internet is kind of following that pattern of social connection. So that's really the first thing, is change sort of happens at these multiple levels. And so when we're creating systems change, we often say that how do you create change at a small level, and how does that have a ripple effect into a wider system or a wider area of influence? So that's the first principle about how the world works. The second is that we need to see the world as a pattern of relationships. So this image on the left-hand side is kind of a lovely, beautiful image of a forest and a river. And we often talk about the world as if they were forests and rivers and mountains. But we don't often think of it as actually the relationships between those things, about the raindrop falling on the mountain, coming down the mountainside, falling on trees, and then going into the river. So we're more interested here in not just the nouns, the objects, but also the relationships, the flows, how they are interconnected. What is the way in which they're actively in a dynamic relationship? And this is a really important shift that we need to make in the world, about how the world works. The third one, I mean, is that we need to look at the world through the lens of emergence. And that is, this picture is a flock of starlings in a murmuration, and they move in a very dynamic way. They're very much interconnected, but their pattern, the pattern that emerges from their movement is different depending on the conditions that they find themselves in. But the rules of how they work really follow a very similar pattern as well. So there can be simple rules in systems that enable a pattern to emerge, and usually this emergence happens through not a linear format, but what we might call an S-curve, a tipping point, when everything feels like it's kind of going in one direction, and then suddenly something shifts and the system becomes a different thing. So those are sort of 3 ideas of kind of living systems and how we can understand the kind of systemic world. The final idea is the idea of consciousness, and this is the sort of the emergence of the property we see in humans, that humans have the emergence of consciousness, the ability to choose and to make decisions about how they want to see the world. And this is critically important for our system change work, as we have the ability to decide and choose what kind of world we want to see, and we want to use this awareness as part of our work. So that's really kind of an introduction to how we might think in systems, how we might think and bring these ideas to the more practical work that we do. So this quote is a critical quote to the work that we see we're doing in the world, that the world is an interconnected social, ecological, psychological, economic system. But the key thing here, and this is the one thing I do want you to take away from this webinar, is we treat it as if it is not, as if it is separate, simple, or finite. And so a lot of our global problems arise directly from this mismatch. And so ourselves at Forum for the Future are really interested in those big, complex challenges of climate change, of social inequity, and how a lot of these problems have derived from the way that we see the world, and therefore how we act in the world. And this is what systems change is trying to address. How do we get more in line with the way the world works, rather than kind of currently the way that a lot of the world is organized and structured? So that's very much the why of what systems change is. So now I'm going to be talking about kind of, okay, what does this really mean in practice? So that's kind of very great theoretical, big ideas. And Forum for the Future are here to think about how we accelerate to a sustainable future, you know, really trying to apply this approach to systemic challenges. We work across the globe in, oh, can't change the slides. We work across the the globe in multiple geographies, in Europe, in the Americas, and across Asia and India and Singapore. We have offices. And we're really trying to apply these to supply chains in terms of climate change and our global resources. But you as foundations or others who are interested in the world of change will be having your own issues across those social, environmental, kind of and economic issues. And we think that a systems change approach can really help us address them. So these are the kind of areas that we work with at Forum for the Future. But again, you will be working in your own areas. And at the School of Systems Change, as part of Forum, we're really interested in how can we help change makers, including those in impact investment and philanthropy, really use these approaches and come together as a community of change to find the right resources and tools to apply to their challenges. So why systems change? What is the purpose of systems change practices? Well, first of all, and this is what we often think about when we think about systems change, we think about the enablement of a better development of an analysis. So we have a challenge. We think about climate change and we go, what can we do about this challenge? But first, before we decide what we do, we need to start thinking about how do we understand that problem? How do we understand its systemic interconnectedness? And this is kind of where we use systems mapping tools, where we use transition tools, where we use futures tools to really help us understand that dynamic and to diagnose the current system that we're a part of. It might also support us with strategic decision making. So just doing an analysis isn't the only need we have. We also want to support the strategic decision making to better understand where we put our energy, where we intervene, which often is called leverage, and also make choices about impact and what does impact mean. But the third area that I really want to emphasize here is it also can help to design how we do our interventions. And this is critically becoming more important in systems change, about how we partnership with others, how we are participatory, how we work in a relationship way. And what does it mean for our funding or impact investing approaches? What does that look like? And I'll return to this later on in a minute when we come to the end of this initial discussion. So we think there are 5 sort of categories of capabilities that help us to achieve these systems change practice: the system diagnostic, the strategy design, the enablement of engagement and collaboration. So how do we actually collaborate? How do we actually come together and participate together? The idea of innovation, but what does innovation for impact mean, for that systemic impact that we're reaching for? But also, how do we as individuals, if we are making choices, or as organizations, how are we learning and how are we leading through this? So we think there are 5 sort of capabilities that we need to be addressing. And don't worry about this diagram. This is not a diagram that I expect you to read and to look at in detail. But I think the point I want to make with this is under each of those sort of capabilities, there is fields of practices. So this isn't saying that systems change is one method or one approach. What it's saying is it's drawing from lots of different approaches. And it's drawing from systemic dynamics, it's drawing from social innovation, from power analysis, from network analysis, from impact work. But the key thing that we're trying to draw from and we're trying to use in our systems change methodology is, are we ensuring that our method is systemic? So not only are we trying to create systems change, the change in the system, we're also trying to ensure that our methodology is systemic. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And part of that, so this is kind of a fun way to try to get into this. So how do we start getting into and understanding how systems change work, and what kind of story like rock and roll tell us about how change happens? So a lot of our theories of change and the way we think about change, as I said, isn't related to the way the world works. So how can we understand how change happens in the world and then relate our strategies according to that? So I'm going to take you through a story of rock and roll. And there is a video of this as well online if you want to sort of see the fun video of this. And it tells the story about using one tool, the multi-level perspective, which we use a lot for the future, that helps to understand the way the change happens in a more systemic way. So, rock and roll. We can maybe understand change as this very complicated theoretical terms that it happens at economic, cultural, sociological levels. But actually, I think telling a story is a much more easy way to understand it than a theoretical quote. So we often think of rock and roll as Elvis Presley. You know, Elvis Presley was the person who brought rock and roll to the way the world works. Whereas actually the point I want to make here is that if we have to sometimes go back through history, this is why, you know, historical analysis and also future trends can really help us understand how change happens. We want to go back to kind of the days of the 30s and 60s and sort of see what was the initial operating environment for rock and roll to emerge. First of all, we can understand what was happening at the landscape level, the kind of big mega trends and social values. So we had racial discrimination, we had the Great Depression, we had World War II. We can also understand what's happening as new innovations and ideas are emerging. So how was electrification happening? What was happening with electric guitars and microphones? And then we also want to understand the day-to-day, the regime, the current mainstream, the status quo. How is that operating? And, you know, we had some dynamics that were happening there around radio stations really booming, which led to the decline of record sales. You know, one system overtakes the other in how we listen to music and what are the social norms around our kind of listening behaviors. We also want to apply it at not just the social level, at the economic level as well, that, you know, it didn't emerge overnight. So we had this merging of rhythms and blues and country music, and a lot of experiments in different types of kind of music, bringing together black and white music, bringing together different styles, experimenting with different forms of innovations. But we also had the big record companies kind of being in a competition for how they were kind of getting the right artists and having takeover. So there's this dynamic of different empires of sound really appropriating and taking different songs and artists. So these dynamics were all playing out through the 40s and 50s. And then we had rock and roll emerge. And at this time, you know, the dynamic that we might see here is, you know, the effect that it had on how we understand record sales, how we understand radio programs, and how social norms were also affecting it. So, you know, people were coming back from the Vietnam War. Teenagers were not having to listen to what their parents were listening to. They were taking the radios up to the bedroom as TVs started to become part of the living room behavior. So all these different areas were kind of coming together and affecting it. So basically, system change is a result of these broader, long-term socio-economical, technical changes, environmental changes in some instances. And so we can kind of break that myth of it emerging out of an individual. It sort of breaks the myth that it comes from an individual, that it emerges overnight, that it's from broader social, environmental changes, and it can still change. Rock and roll isn't the kind of normal way of hearing music now. It continues to evolve and change. So these are really important lessons for how we work with change in these social environmental problems. What does this start to mean? What does this start to mean for how change happens? And we can use methods and tools like this multi-level perspective to help us understand, you know, what is happening at these big trends level. You know, what impact will coronavirus at the moment have on the way that our economy is working? What impact will massive biosphere collapse in the Antarctic have in the way our land use is working, the way our economy is structured, and what new innovations like regenerative practices or different ways that we use technology, different generational shifts will start having on the way we operate, and how can we start understanding these as one analysis and one way of looking at change. And these can start to kind of affect how we look at our strategies for change as well. How do we start understanding, you know, the shift in culture and behaviors? How do we start understanding how we make information more available? What are our interventions for change? How do we understand the right incentives in the mainstream? And what's our role in really enabling disruptive innovations or scaling new innovations for change at different phases of this kind of changing environment? So there are multiple interventions, and a lot of interventions really are down to the dynamics and kind of where you stand in the system and where do you want to affect change. So if we want to affect change in the energy system at Forum, actually the mainstream can be quite stuck. So we're really interested in how does community energy emerge, or if we're working in India, how are we kind of supporting the emergence of a new system. Whereas when we're working in the food system, a lot of those businesses are ready to innovate and evolve. So we work with the regime. So where we place our energy really is different for different questions, different places, and can affect what we do. So what does systems change mean? Systems change, there are lots of different definitions out there of what systems change is. This is just our and my definition. Systems change is the emergence, this kind of emergence of a new pattern of organizational system structure, a new way that the world works. And it can be the process by which we continually create change in a systemic form. So a lot of people use systems change as the sort of process of change that is systemically. And it can also be an outcome, the shift. We often use the word systems change as, we want to create systems change. We want to create the change in one system to another. And we can't get stuck in the idea that that systems change is just about policy change. When some people say, let's change the system, they mean let's change the bigger context which we sit in, but not recognizing that a lot of that is in the dynamics. The outcome is the shift in the whole pattern of the system, not just one element of it. And we can look at that through these 4 different patterns: the pattern of structure and the pattern of flows, the pattern of how we organize, and how the relationships, it's almost like the power behind that, the patterns of our different interventions, and asking ourselves, how are we moving towards what we call whole system goals, and also the pattern of thinking, what worldview, what paradigm is our work coming from, and we can maybe understand these 4 kind of levels of outcome really at the basis of kind of systems change leverage, which is, a lot of our work is held within system goals, within relationships, but it's also held within the worldview and paradigm. So, we can try to change the structure of the system, but actually we need to be aware that they sit within wider relationships and paradigms, and we need to kind of pay attention to those with our strategies as well. So we've got a few minutes left of this presentation. What I want to sort of finish on is sort of some examples and sort of saying, what does this sometimes mean in practice? So practically, these are some systemic practices we have pulled out from a range of tools and practitioners and contributors we have at the School of System Change and we work with. So there's different ways. These are kind of like a way to think about, am I enabling the system to see itself? Am I working at multiple levels? Am I looking for connections? Am I engaging different perspectives? So when we work in value chains, am I looking at the farmer perspective compared to the big business perspective? Am I understanding the kind of the edges of the system, whereas the mainstream? Am I understanding the power and responsibility in that, and understanding what the activating and resisting forces are? What is stopping change rather than what is activating change? Am I working at different timescales? Am I understanding that pattern to help me make interventions? And am I embracing complexity and constantly questioning my assumptions and learning and adapting? So what does this mean in practice? At For of the Future, we run multiple projects, as I say, and actually one critical systemic intervention, it seems really simple, is actually really important. Is this reframing of the question or reframing of the system goal. We try to work on meat production and issues of how do we reduce meat production or working with dairy industry. And we shifted we tried to do that for many years, and we realized that it wasn't really resonating in the system. People weren't wanting to work with us on it. And then we shift the goal of the system, say, what is this goal of this system? The goal of the system is to provide us with our protein needs. And so we then launched the protein challenge to say, how do we as organizations and people work to serve 9 billion people's needs? So we started to work with a set of initial key members, and now we kind of expand that to come together across the system and say, how do we achieve our protein needs? We did a system map. We tried to understand the different relationship between the meat system, the alternative systems, the fish system, the plant system, and where different interventions might be for change. We found where were there innovations, where can we start finding areas for action, where are the leverage points, where's the energy for change. And so this was kind of a project that we've been running for many years now. And one of the interesting insights, one interesting projects that's come out of that is something called the Chef's Challenge, just working at the consumer end, also working at the production end of the system as well, is, how do we change the narrative on our plate, on the challenge of, the future of the plate being more orientated towards plant-based food rather than just meat food? And how do we not sort of set this as a campaign, which is saying this is what it needs to be, but how do we engage people like chefs to change the nature of our diets? And that's just one example of a project that's kind of emerged out of that diagnosis. And so we're also working with foundations very much in terms of how we're supporting their practice, really thinking about how they're developing a systemic theory of change. So how do we understand the system? How do we understand strategy? How do we understand their role in intervening? And how do we kind of use that to work towards the goals and the system boundaries? So one project that we're working with at the moment is Robert Bosch Foundation, or Stiftung. And we've been working with them. It's a live project at the moment, trying to look at their migration system change strategy as well as their climate change system change strategy. And system change in action often looks like this. It often looks like a lot of workshops of trying to map out different dynamics in the system, trying to understand how we're bringing together lots of different ideas and issues, and trying to consolidate around what are the goals that we want to achieve. How do we bring in it into system maps, into the discourse of what we're doing. So this is just an example of kind of us coaching them through their strategy process, of really helping teams use this way of thinking to kind of interrogate and to build new strategy, and to start thinking about how they might also deliver change. You know, what is their role as a foundation in also delivering change? So as I say, this is very emergent in what's happening. So again, just to finish here, just to remind ourselves that we can sort of think about systems change as, you know, what is the system change we want to create, but it really is for me about the underlying systemic practices that we want to be taking into our change efforts. So really helping us think differently about how we create change. And what does this mean for those in philanthropy or investment? What is your influence and role in the system of change? You know, how are you? What's your unique position within systems change? So I think what it does and what it can offer is if a lot of impact or change makers are trying to address complex challenges. So a systems change approach can help you have the ability to look at the bigger picture and to really step out of kind of the small scale interventions and think about what is the bigger picture. It can also change the way we think about impact and long-term sustainable impact in terms of what we value and where we put our energy. It can take risks. A system change approach can help you take risks and really have an emergent strategy and change the way what we value, and move from just a measure and evaluate model to also a learning model, to kind of be iterative and let go of knowing what's going to happen. I mean, the world is rapidly changing at the moment. And so a lot of what we need to do is kind of have that adaptable approach in order to create long-term impact. I think critically for those with money and in philanthropy is how we're using our power to change. Power is often at the root cause of a lot of problems. And so how are we using our power to create change, and how do we use that in a kind of an ethical way? And it also, what's the role to help convene the ecosystem? So it's not just about necessarily funding. It's saying, a lot of philanthropy is now thinking about what's their role in not just providing funding, but also helping to create spaces for shared purpose, helping create momentum and energy for change. There's a lot of work that's also needed in this pace to create spaces to co-develop solutions, to really refine what we do toward shared purposes. And this takes a bit of investment to see that long-term change. So these are just a few stimulus to think about. And obviously, as I said, this presentation has very much been a short whirlwind tour of what we can do and what we look at the School of System Change. We have 6 month programs. We do coaching with foundations. We also do short introductory sessions for people to really start getting to understand how they can access and use these flexible tools and experiences and case studies in what we do. So hopefully that is a good introduction. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. Please do share your questions with us, and I'm sorry we can't see you. And now I'm going to hand back over to hear from Anya and Saskia to talk about another example in a foundation. And also apologies for the noise. It was very quiet here this morning, and then I've now hit upon the lunch break, so I do apologize for that.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Anna. That was great, and a good overview on what system change is all about. I assume there are now many questions, or at least I hope also that that it raised some, or it resonated with the work that you do, your interests. Maybe it also raised some questions about the role of investors for impact in that story. What is it actually? Where are we currently as an investing for impact community in facilitating and supporting system change? So I'd like you to think about these questions and any other questions that you may have with Anna and also later Saskia. And we will have hopefully more opportunity to talk about them in more detail. But now, without further ado, I would like to introduce you again to Saskia, and also invite her to share her experience with thinking about system change as an investor for impact, as a foundation working on very complex social challenges. Please just bear with me a second while I enable her to speak. Just a second. So Saskia, are you?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Can you speak now? Yes.
Brilliant.
I'll try and make it possible so that we can also see you. Just bear with me, but just
I don't see myself,
talking.
which is a bit weird, but I'll just
yeah,
not be distracted by that.
Yes, we'll have to get on top of the technology still here, practicing. But I hope we can sort it out, and at least we can see you. I think in the next slide we should be we should be able to. So this is Saskia von those. Thank you very much for being with us, and maybe you can share a little bit about what Adesium is, what the focus is of your organization, and why you are starting to look at system change and why this is relevant to your organization.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to talk about what we do and how we work. I plan to talk a little bit about what Adesium does, just really briefly to have an idea of who we are and what we do, and then talk a little bit more about how we go about that. So Adesium Foundation is a grant-making family foundation based here in the Netherlands. Our annual grant-making budget is between 15 and 18 million. This year is a rather exciting year for us because it's our 15th anniversary, and it's actually a great time to reflect upon our learnings over the years and the programs that we've developed, and take those into a new strategic framework going forward. And I guess over the years we've supported organizations and projects that work on real important societal challenges, and we look to support organizations that work towards a lasting positive change. And I will speak a bit more about that because that's obviously where the systems perspective comes in. Our geographic focus is Europe, and within that the Netherlands, because that's our home base. And we put a lot of value in supporting our grantees, not only financially, but also we like to work closely with them to see where we can strengthen their capability to deliver the work that they do as effectively as possible. And so we spend quite a bit of time on evaluating projects midterm, but also have additional donations available, for example, to provide additional support in terms of developing strategies, fundraising, or actually whatever they need. It could be communications or new IT systems. So that is a little bit about how we work and what we work on. Anja already briefly mentioned, maybe into the next slide, is that we work on 3 programs. No, it's not there. So I'll just skip that. Anja just already briefly mentioned that. So why do we think it's important to work on systems change? I think what why we do that is that we see that at some point the current systems just don't work anymore, and we need to address societal challenges that are the consequence of that, to be able to go towards a new system. And we think it's important to work on or rather, let me put it in a different way. Over the years, where in the beginning we would focus more on relieving problems or cleaning up problems rather than working on real solutions. And that's been a big learning for us over the years, to have a different perspective to work on what we call real solutions. So what does that approach look like for us at the DESIUM? Coming from the sort of more on the ground practical projects to an approach where we would like to work on the solutions, it's actually that in our portfolio right now we have a very interesting combination of, I guess, boots on the ground and our heads in the cloud type projects. And the interesting thing about this is that we actually learn a great deal of what needs to change, what's not working well from the projects on the ground, and look for smart ways to bring that information into more of a systems perspective on what needs to change, and looking for other types of organizations to, and sometimes even the same organizations, to bring those perspectives into, for example, policy changes or other important changes towards a new system. We do this from an integrated approach. So we look for combining promising pathways or interventions, multiple interventions to address an issue. And I guess that also speaks a lot to what Anna was saying before, that there is no one solution to many of these complex problems. So we could be working on raising the awareness of citizens, to working on advocacy for policy change, working on new business models and innovation, and working across a value chain, really. How do we do that? So basically the theory of change is our starting point. And when I looked at Anna's presentation, I realized that we could be much better even at understanding the systems dynamics. So we still have a lot to learn in that area, but that is how we go about it. We identify the different pathways and choose those that we think that we as a DESIUM are best positioned to contribute to. We look for what could be meaningful disruptors or promising interventions that basically show an emergence of a new systems that is coming up there, and how can we support those valuable initiatives to flourish. And then another key element of how we work is that we focus a lot on, I guess, convening the ecosystem is what Anna just called it, is on collaborating between funders on the one hand, and also enabling our grantees to work together. And I would like to share with you an interesting example of work that we funded over the course of, I guess it's now up to 8 years, in the area of plastics pollution. When we started off that work, it was all about cleanups and beach cleanups, maybe a little bit of awareness raising by funding documentaries. But over the years, we figured out that really we need to look, get into get into this type of work from a different perspective, looking much more along the value chain of where do these problems arise and how can we solve them. As a funder, you often have the advantage of sort of being able to hover above a field and see where organizations are talking or not talking to each other, or where they should be, and actually where they could be collaborating to come to a much more effective approach. And what we did in this field of plastics is that we gathered around with a number of funders, larger funders, to set up the Plastic Solutions Fund, which allowed us to pool a quite substantial amount of funding which then allowed us to actually help us to convene the field and build a global movement of organizations all around the world that work to battle this plastic pollution. And with this funding, we were able to enable those organizations to come together and to create a shared purpose and a shared strategy. And with the funding, we were able to actually fund projects that were then the result of that strategic thinking. And it's been interesting to see that on the one hand, funders working together, learning from each other has been really valuable, but on the other hand, the field, the ecosystem, allowing the ecosystem to work together, provide funding also, not necessarily only for the project, but also provide funding for the organizing, for their gatherings, for their strategic processes has been enormously helpful to make big steps. And I think we can safely say, and I say that with a lot of pride, that, for example, the recent European directive on single-use plastics, not saying that is only the result of this work, but the groups that have been working on that on the ground in Europe on advocacy, funded by this coalition of funders, have played a real important part in that. And yeah, I think that's a great example actually of how we go about it, and the value of this approach, or the view, the systems view to how we work. And obviously that's not always easy. So maybe I can get to the next slide, which talks about the key challenges. And an important challenge is, for us has been, and I guess still is, how do you go from those interesting, disruptive, single pilot projects to really creating that ripple effect or the snowball effect into a new system? And I think oftentimes it's also a matter of being patient and realizing that this doesn't happen overnight. And I think the rock and roll example really showed you that there is a lot of other factors in play also to be able to get to a new system, and it's not that one thing that you should be focusing on. So a real important challenge, and one that we are still learning on a lot and would like to learn more about. So if there's people that can share interesting examples or learnings on that, do speak up. And related to this, I guess, is the challenge on how to avoid lock-ins into the current system. So how do you avoid supporting interesting new innovations that are not necessarily helping us on the path towards a new system? So can I think of a great example? Well, I think if you look at, for example, plastics, if you look at recycling, obviously is an interesting solution to the reduction of plastic pollution. However, if you focus too much on recycling, it allows the system to continue to function as it is, because you have a way of getting rid of the issues that it's creating, the pollution in this case. So in the plastic example, an interesting thing that happened is that we realized that we needed to work on a new narrative. So the narrative of only recycling is not going to help us to really solve this problem. The narrative should be on the reduction, the stopping of the use of plastic, especially the single-use plastic. So, and I think this has been quite a successful narrative change that we've seen happening also with the single-use plastic directives at the EU level as one of the results of that. And then there is the challenge of directing government or other funding to those real transformative options and battling, I guess, against those that have vested interest in the current system. Another example of work that we fund in the Netherlands is where we shift the current system of care for children in precarious situations from curing rather than to preventing a lot of the issues. And one of the big issues to make that shift happen is actually that the funding system for the care as it is currently organized is not allowing for organizations, shelters or other care type organizations to spend their money on prevention, because the way the government budgeting is worked, they get paid for curing. So we're funding a number of smaller pilots to experiment with how can you actually shift the system upside down and direct the funding in a different way, with the obvious challenges on who needs to fund up front is not necessarily the beneficiary of the results and the benefits of that later on in the system. So these are all kinds of things that we need to work out and figure out as we go along in working on the transformations and the shifting of the patterns that we would like to see happen. With that, I would like to now really encourage you to come up with some questions, especially for Anna, and I'd be really pleased to answer some questions as well from our practical point of view. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Saskia. That's great, because it really shows a practical application on how a system of practice is being used. We have a couple of questions here from our participants, but I like to ask both of you really about the implication that a systems approach has on the capacity of the individuals in these organizations. I know, Anna, you are specifically working on that and trying to build up a certain systems change capacity. Now, starting from the practical example with Saskia. Saskia, for you, applying this kind of approach, what does it take for an organization internally really to move into that direction?
An organization like a Decium, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. I guess for us, it came quite sort of as a result of a natural learning process for us. As I said, how we started working in the beginning was quite different from what we see now, and it really, I guess, grew from our own desire to not only address an issue, but really look at how can we solve an issue. And over the years, also with the growing experience of our program managers, who more and more get to know the field, get to know the issue, also having that bird's eye view sometimes over an ecosystem has helped us in that. And as I said, I think we're only in the beginning and learning still every day on how to do this. And there's definitely many ways in which we can do this better. So I wouldn't want to imply that we are the expert of this at the moment, not at all.
And I think there are interesting challenges at the organizational level. So I think, as I was saying, the systems approach requires you to think of it as a fractal, so at multiple levels. And so there's got a capacity of the individual, and then there's the capacity of the organization. So, how do you work with your board? The board might differently, or how do you change your partnership models? How do you change a strategy process that might be more kind of input, outcome, impact orientated to more of an emergent strategy? So therefore you need to change your monitoring, evaluation and learning and adaptation approach. and even at Forum for the Future, we've been really experimenting with how do we both operate in a current financial system, and also experiment with small ways of systemic working, like change the way we run our meetings, change the way we make our decisions. So I guess it is both kind of straightforward systems, and it is quite different. You know, one of the foundations we're working with, we had a check-in with them yesterday, and they were talking about, she said, it's like learning to play a new sport. You know, she was saying it really feels different, that she's using different muscles in her mind and her body to do this. So it is also a long-term learning journey. You know, we introduce people in, you know, an introductory course for 6 months is really about opening people up to a lifelong learning journey of how do we think and act differently, because so much in our current world and our organizational structures don't allow us to operate in this way, or isn't set up to, should we say. So it's almost, that is also part of the system that we're seeking to change.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you bring that up, Anna. For example, the issue about how you get your boards along. I think in the past there was a real hesitance for us to work in funders collaboratives, for example, because we were afraid that we would lose our autonomy in decision making. And if you see how we work today, almost all of our work is done in collaboration with other funders in all ways of collaborating, from just sharing information to really pooling our funds and making decisions together. And to see how enthusiastic our board now is on the work that we do in collaboration with other funders is really interesting to see. But that has been a bit of a journey internally for us as well, to be able to do that, and yeah, and see what it also brings us.
Excellent. Thank you so much to you both. I can see many questions coming in on different levels in relation to what you said, but also new questions. I'd like to ask.
I can't see any questions. Am I supposed to see questions as well? Because I don't see them.
No, I will help. I will help you. Don't worry.
Great.
Don't worry. We'll see how we manage. So there is a question from Leonie. And Leonie, are you still there with us, Leonie Houtning? Yes, Leonie. You asked a couple of questions, and one that seemed to me particularly relevant in this conversation about how to actually do this in practice is the question about first the sources of funding. So you're saying, how can I actually think about a system change when the funding that I get is very short term? And I assume you're probably, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the background of your question and which organization you work for. And secondly, and maybe this is also related to this, how do we really get the staff to take the time to reflect on systemic barriers while there's so much focus on delivering on the day-to-day basis? And this is also a question that was expressed by was it Sari Godard? I hope I pronounce it correctly. Maybe Sari, you can come in after Leonie. Can you tell us a little bit more about the background of your question?
Yes, sure.
Leonie,
so,
please, yeah.
Yes, thank you. So my name is Leonie Houtning. I'm working for SNV. And at the moment, we are really looking into also taking a more of a systems change approach to how we implement our projects. And I think from what we are finding is our projects are usually, funded by DGIS, by DFID, by USAID, and often we're locked into like a 4-year project with maybe, if we're lucky, in an extension. But the systems change perspective is really something that a lot of donors are increasingly asking for to achieve. And then the question is, okay, but how can we achieve something as big as systems change in a 4-year project? So that's one issue. But on the internal side, what we're noticing is that people understand the systems change approach, but a lot of our staff are just so focused on implementing the project, and they're in the project So to actually take the time to reflect back and understand the system and what's changing in power relations is quite a struggle for us, I think.
Thank you, Leonie. That's that's very common.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes,
go
ahead.
To jump in,
do
or?
you have any reaction to that?
So,
yes, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I definitely do. And I think there's something around the idea that you can achieve system changes 4 years is falsehood. It's always about what contribution you can make to systems change. So it's a lot of how we talk about it is, how do we understand the dynamics of a changing system? Like, you know, the music system is a fun example we used a minute ago. Like, how do you understand the dynamics of that? And therefore, you're always intervening in that changing system. And therefore, if you were having a donor with 4 years, a 4-year funding, one of the big things is also, how do you adapt through that 4-year process as well? Because the system around you will change also in that 4 years. The system is always changing. And therefore, how do you have an approach that and a relationship with your donor that enables you to be in learning mode? And they recognize that as a key part of the cycle of implementing. So it's not this separate thing to implementing. Learning is a key part of getting feedback from the system and saying, well, actually, we now need to do things differently. We need to be more agile. And especially when we see, you know, more and more crises in the world, from climate change impacts to, you know, even corona impacts, we need to have that adaptability in the system. So that's one answer to it. But then the other one is pretty much what I said before, which is around this idea of, you know, we therefore need to change this kind of relational dynamic between the way organizations run and therefore what donors expect from us. So just saying, oh, we want you to create systems change, but we're going to still impose this similar way of working, is almost part of the problem, and it's almost part of our own lock-in to what we do. And that doesn't mean, you know, I always say that this isn't about also doing things radically different in a kind of a, you're still going to be implementing, you're still going to be delivering, but it's the mindset you bring to that, and therefore the structures of the way we do things that do need to change. And the problem is the stop-start. We need to invest time in our capacity to change that way of thinking. And then once we change that way of thinking, it's not necessarily more onerous. Like, this is a misconception. I don't think it's less onerous. Actually, it could be more agile. It could be more freeing, because the way we report might change. The way we, you know, we don't report to funders. We actually just have more investment in learning instead of reporting. And there's this really, you know, so it's where we choose to put our energy, rather than, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to spend hours out analyzing. We analyze anyway. It's just the mindset we bring to what we do.
Yeah, and then maybe from our perspective, because this is really telling to sort of the journey that we've been through at Adesium. So we moved away from sort of more rigid logic frames to having a totally different conversation in our monitoring meetings with our grantees, talking much more about, you have this sort of the big goal ahead of you that you want to work towards, what are the milestones, but also in full realization of that the world is constantly changing. We're not going to set anymore, because we used to do that, indicators for what you need to achieve, but much more have the conversation on how are you faring on that path towards the big goal that you want to achieve, and if you take a different turn, let's have a discussion on why do you think you need to take a different turn, what have you learned from what didn't work well, and what do you think should work better in the future going forward. So to have a completely different type of conversation actually with the grantees, and learn with them actually from their process and what they go through.
Thank you, Saskia. That's really interesting, and I would like to bring in Carlos here into that conversation, because Carlos from Spain, are you with us? Can you hear us? Your question was really in relation to measuring this kind of systemic impact that you then create. And the question was specifically addressed to Anna, whether you could tell us a little bit more about the methods and tool for measuring. But maybe, Saskia, you have also something to add how it works for you in practice. Carlos, did I get this correctly?
Yeah, I wrote the question before Saskia intervention. So the question is for both, please.
Yep.
I'm interested in measuring the global impact, the global change. Which methods are you using for that? if you have some ideas of that.
Can you,
Yeah.
sorry, Carlos, can you tell us a little bit about your background and where this question is
I am
coming
a professor at the university,
Uh-huh.
and now I am setting up a chair for social impact. I am working a lot with some investing funds in Spain, and also I am working in measuring the change using social return on investment mainly, but not only. I'm doing some research on that. And also we are trying to create a postgraduate course, both in investing and in measuring. So I am very interested in hear from you and maybe in the future to collaborate.
Okay, Anna, you want to go first?
I'm happy to. I mean, I think measuring, so this is also about the contribution attribution question, like what can we measure? And I think we can monitor. I think there's a question of monitoring change, like we're actually monitoring how change is happening. And I think some of that is measurable. If we think about it, it's kind of what are we trying to capture rather than what are we trying to monitor and understand. So I think there's a slight distinction there. And what are the types of indicators we need to understand that kind of global change and the shifts in it? And I think the indicators of like, we are asking ourselves, how do we know a system is shifting? And so how do we know a system is shifting? It might be a change in the way the narrative or the change in the framing of the system. And that really is kind of working at that paradigm level. Or how do we know a system is shifting? Do we see behaviors or investments or change activities orientating towards different goals? So is it orientating towards actually making a more flourishing food system, for example? How would we know that that was happening? Or how do we notice new emerging models that are really working at that fractal level that are starting to affect change? And so it's more like indicators of a changing system rather than the system has shifted from one thing to another, but really understanding what behaviors we're expecting to see as part of a bigger goal that has shifted. And then also there's something about monitoring the global change and not trying to distinguish like, oh, which bit was our bit, which was the bit that we changed, and then knowing what the quality interventions we're using are, and we can measure our own quality interventions about how far our reach is, or who we work with, or even our quality of our strategic thinking, and that is when the theory of change is really important, because it is only a theory. So that's why it's really important to put in that monitoring and learning approach to really enable it. So hopefully that kind of answers your question about, you know, is it always measuring, and which bits, and really going for the big change and really tracking what's happening in the world, and not getting too caught up with the attribution, sorry, I can't say that word, attribution, and thinking about, okay, but have we got a quality understanding of how we think we're affecting change?
Yes, and Saskia, from your practical experience, how did you go about this? I assume there were some people, some stakeholder in Adessium Foundation who, in the beginning at least, were not quite happy to say, "Oh, we go do away with all these indicators and measuring," and we are more flexible about that.
Yeah, we never were really those indicator measuring types, I guess, but I think it's much more about in the end sort of the story of change, and realizing, as Anna said very eloquently, it's very difficult to attribute your particular contribution to that change, because it's a lot of moving panels, and if you're able to move a number of those panels in the right direction and be part of that, I think that is the story we look for ourselves to tell. And I think in our last annual report, we made an effort in bringing a few of those stories to light, where we look back over the years. Where did we start? What was happening then? What did we see changing? What are the things that we were contributing to, but also what are other elements that were changing in the system that also help move us in the right direction? Yeah, so that's how we go about it at Adessium. Not trying to aggregate indicators or in any way attribute all of these changes to us or the work that we funded.
Thank you so much. There was a question from. Oh, sorry.
Oh, thank you. Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Carlos.
Perfect. Thank you, Carlos, for that question. There was a question earlier from Zeri Godard. I hope I pronounced it correctly. On what this means in relation to gender impact investing and the field of equality, and how we can really change and encourage, and you're saying encourage folks working on changing one system to reflect another. Can you tell us a little bit more what you mean with it?
I can, thank you. Yeah, it's Kerry Goddard, but it's a funny Welsh spelling. Hi, yeah, I'm Kerry. I direct the Equality Impact Investing project, which is a collaboration between a number of different funders, grant funders, impact investors, and also equality and human rights actors in the UK and increasingly in Europe and transnationally as well. So that's where I'm coming from. I want to say, first of all, that our research really reflected what both the speakers have said in terms of a tendency both with state funders but also private foundations, etc., to focus on mitigation rather than transformation. And we particularly found that to be the case when it came to structural inequality, or gender inequality and inequality more broadly. And we concluded that it was partly because there was quite a significant blind spot, amongst grantees, but also amongst funders themselves, just, a lack of awareness of this system and how it operates, and critically, how it operates and impacts on all the other systems they're concerned with, health or unemployment or the environment, etc. So, one of the things we've been doing is trying to develop practical strategies for investors and for grantees. But, in that context, I wondered what, both your speakers thought about that, particularly where there's low recognition of one system. I mean, inequality is a case in point, but it could be another one. What practical strategies do you have to, if you're supporting system change in one area, let's just say health or the environment, how you can practically lever your support or lever your role to ensure that either your grantees or other funders are taking account of other systems. So that'd be really interesting to hear your views on that. And just two really quick points just to say, Carlos, if you're still there, we've done some particular stuff on equality impact measurement, which I'm happy to talk to you about separately. And you're so right about the story. Our biggest learning was we're trying to change the narrative from moving from diversity impact to equality impact. Basically, the story is helping us work with funders to understand this is systemic and not just about diversity. It's very interesting. But yeah, I'm really interested in your ideas on practically supporting across systems and awareness between systems. I know you touched on that, Anna, in your presentation, actually. But
yeah, but no, I've got something more to say on that, because I think I love your frame. I think we're also framing from diversity to inequality, and actually, power is the kind of, how is power asymmetrical in the system is a key question for any systems changer. So how, and if you were to really do any systems change work well, you would be asking questions, not just what's happening in health or the environment, whatever your starting question is. You should be asking yourself questions of power, and how does power play out, and asymmetries of power play out across that system. So if there is asymmetries of power in gender, for example, or race, or finance, or whatever it might be, you wouldn't have done a good system analysis unless you have touched on something and to see what's in that system. And I think that is in the iceberg model really kind of it requires you to really dig underneath the surface and understand those, like you say, the structural power inequalities and how they manifest within whatever that problem area. And so if people are taking a system approach, it should enable people to understand gender inequality better, because they should be paying attention to all these intersectional issues within, an issue that might not at first glance seem to be related to gender, but most of the time they totally are.
Yeah.
Thanks. Maybe in relation, Saskia, you want to add something on that?
No, I just wanted to add that this is actually one of the blind spots that I've identified for us going forward in our new strategy to really pay much more attention to. I think we're really at the first steps of realizing how we should go about that. So it would also be really interested to hear more from Kerry about what you can bring to us as funders, because we look at power dynamics usually from a funder grantee perspective, but failing to look completely at other aspects of those inequalities, especially gender, is not on our radar at the moment at all, but it's definitely on our radar to be explored in the future. So thank you for that. That's a great reminder of that. Thanks.
Thanks very much. The reason I asked the question.
Brilliant.
Go ahead.
I was going to say thanks, but the reason I asked the question is, and Anna, I thought that was a great answer. I think the challenge is, and I take your point on analysis, but what do you do if the analysis you're talking about or the recognition of an issue isn't even there?
Yep.
And yeah, I've just said to Anya, what I'll do is I'll send her the link to our report. It's called Equality Impact Investing from Principles to Practice. It's got all of our research, lots of strategies, and then that can go around. And anybody who wants to, well, we actually worked with EBPA on the gender stuff, but that was a while ago now. And we were just coming to talk to you very soon. Sorry, but yeah, I'll send it, and then anybody talk to me. So we've done a lot you can use already, and we're going to be doing a meetings in Brussels in about 6 weeks, but we're going to probably be having to postpone it, unfortunately.
Yeah,
but, yeah. I'll just send the info, and anybody please reach out. It'd be really good because it's a really new field and it's just being developed. And as I say, it's a collaborative. It's not one organisation or just me. So it'd be good to get your input.
Great. That sounds like this is exactly why we're organizing these meetings, that the people get to know each other and suddenly discovering they're working on stuff that is really interesting to all of us, really. I have a question here. I actually have two questions here from Wuhan about two things really, about whether systems as such has a sort of normative, what we mean with system in a sense, whether it has a normative connotation, whether it could mean the capitalist system and then being replaced by impact investing instead. And the other one was specifically whether there were some recommendations for specific impact assessment tools that can be, I assume, used in systems analysis, but maybe you can express it in a better way, Wuhan, please. You can, Wuhan, are you still there? I think maybe he has, maybe he has left us. In the meantime, he was very active on asking questions. So by the way, if you have some comments on what has been said, you should be able to raise your hand, then I can see you if you want to add to that conversation. There is Carlos who's just raising your hand. Is that something that has been already covered, or you have something to add on what has been said, Carlos? Seems we lost him as well. So if are there more questions that you want to raise? So you have the possibility to use the question section in your control panel and simply ask that question to me, and I will try and bring it up, or you can raise your hand. So, but while we wait for people to comment and ask more questions, maybe. I have a question to you really about what do you think could be done on a systemic level from a perspective of EPA? What could be done to raise awareness about the importance of a systemic approach in impact investing and financing and supporting impact activities? Maybe question to both
two things.
Anna and Saskia.
Yeah. Saskia, do you want to go first?
And I encourage the attendees as well to contribute, if you like.
I guess I'll start then. The two things that I would say are, I think, as any association, as a network can create, is legitimacy of the approach and really being able to ask questions, and also trying to help people make it very practical and to share that journey. So there's kind of a legitimizing of what it means to do this approach. But also I think what's needed is, actually, I think funders, what does it mean for funders to take a systems approach? It's not just how individual funders are working with their grantees or the people they're investing in. I think there is something about pooled funding, and it's really an emerging field. But what does it mean to have pooled funding, and what does it mean to have shared decision-making mechanisms? So actually the people who receive the fund, this is really starting to address power issues. Who makes decisions and who decides are really important kind of questions in systems. It's quite radical from where we are today, but there's quite an interesting kind of what would it mean to experiment and collaborate across different impact investors and funders to help them take that risk? Or what would it mean to experiment in that space and provide connective tissue between different organizations to do it? So yeah, there's something about helping that kind of facilitative capacity to bringing those funders together to be able to kind of collaborate on something like that.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So what you're saying, it would not be only about bringing people together, but really also establishing the tools and capacities that are required to collaborate effectively. Okay.
Exactly, and helping that process, not just tools, but really supporting that process.
Saskia, is there anything you would like to add on that? Any advice you can give to EVPA on our system change journey?
Yeah, I think there would be great value in actually doing what you always do really well in terms of in the network, getting those great examples and learnings to the surface and bundle them in one of your great publications and maybe workshops or trainings about that. I think that would be tremendously helpful. That's one thing. And another thing is, I think there could be an interesting opportunity to set something up like a learning network where those that are doing this or those that are interested in doing is get together, share their experience, share their learnings, examples, and yeah, to use the network in that sense in a wise way.
Well, thank you very much. That's great advice. I will happily take this forward, and I think it connects quite well to our upcoming activities and plans on that topic going forward. So we actually do have a webinar coming up on the 29th, together with Co-Impact and Ashoka, on exactly the topic of pooled funding, which is one of the topics that Co-Impact is very passionate about, and also about the role of funders in facilitating system change. This will be a member-only webinar, unfortunately, but there are other opportunities to engage with us on that topic. We have the annual conference coming up on the 24th and 25th on September, so save your date on that one, where we will definitely have the topic in our very practical workshop session. So there may be something like a lab process where we will experience these practices ourselves. And we do hope that it will also lead to make people think more about the importance of system practice and what it means to their own work and how they can actually apply it to real societal challenges. We are coming to the end of our webinar. We would really like to know from you what this topic means to you and what we can come up with that meets really your needs. So please take a few minutes after this webinar to respond to the survey questions that will pop up at the end of this session. Otherwise, you're very welcome to reach out to me directly. So here are my contacts. You'll find me also on the EVPA website. I can also put you in touch with our speakers, and we are really happy to stay in touch with whoever is interested in this topic. So really thank you to all participants for joining this session, for your contributions, but mostly also to thank you to Anna and Saskia for contributing to that. It was really, really great to have you on board, and I do hope we'll stay in touch on the topic of investing for impact and system change. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for listening and for your questions.
Thank you very much.